China's smog could make it more difficult for people to fight off some infections. The air pollution has traces of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. A team from a university in Sweden took over 800 samples of DNA from humans, animals, and various environments across the globe. In Beijing, the air samples contain DNA from genes that make bacteria resistant to some of the most powerful antibiotics we have, including carbapenems. Carbapenems are a sort of last resort antibiotic doctors can prescribe to treat certain infections caused by resistant bacteria. The team notes there's probably a mix of live and dead bacteria in the air, and it's the live bacteria that could be a real threat.
According to the Associated Press, Southerners are beginning to feel the effects of a drought that is continuing past its 8th month. Among the damages, water fountains have dried up, beaver dams have been demolished, and drinking water in one southern town is turned brown. Watering lawns and washing cars have been restricted in parts of the South, and more restrictions are expected if below normal rainfall continues through the rest of 2016. The EPA has reported low streams and dropping reservoirs, which may not be sufficient for getting residents through the winter.
Arctic sea ice is melting at such an alarming rate that scientists are warning it might trigger uncontrollable changes across the globe. The Arctic Resilience Report, published Friday following a 5-year study, warns of 19 tipping points, conditions that, once met, fundamentally alter the function of an ecosystem. One of the biggest points of no return in the Arctic would be a change in thermohaline circulation, an ocean current that distributes heat and ocean water around the globe. Large amounts of warm, fresh water, like what comes off melting glaciers and ice caps, could disrupt or even stop that current. But scientists admit this happening is highly unlikely. We're already seeing isolated incidents of a few tipping points, though. In parts of the Arctic, scientists have seen collapses of food webs where large predatory fish almost completely vanish and leave only their prey. Most of the tipping points are actually shifts in ecosystems: tundra to forest, marshes to tidal flats, coniferous to deciduous forests, that sort of thing. But shifts like those are a pretty big deal. Usually only a small subpopulation of species has the genes to survive such shifts, leading to a major loss in genetic diversity. And as ecosystems dominated by permafrost begin to thaw, methane, an incredibly strong greenhouse gas, gets released into the atmosphere.
According to the China Earthquake Network Center, the epicenter is at Akto County in the Kazilsu-Kurikudzi Autonomous Prefecture. 90% of the prefecture's territory are mountainous areas.
This time, it had a magnitude of 6.7. We estimate that about 40,000 people were within the perimeter of the tremor, measuring magnitude 6 or above this time.
Several old and dilapidated buildings were found with cracks and other forms of damage. Residents living in such buildings have been relocated, but most of the houses in the affected area remain intact.
Do any buildings have cracks or have any collapsed?
There aren't any, but those old houses could suffer damage.
Sections of the railway in southern Xinjiang have been closed temporarily.
An estimated 1.5 million people rallied in Seoul on Saturday in the 5th week of protests against President Park Geun-hye. 3 major opposition parties sent delegates to attend the protest and said they would jointly submit a draft impeachment proposal to the parliament next month. Opposition say 40 MPs from the ruling Saenuri party support the proposal.
Countless candles glow in the night sky as the people chant, hoping their voice can make the difference.
Braving the cold weather, hundreds of thousands of people have taken to the streets for the 5th straight weekend. Together, holding up the candles, they're demanding the president step down over the ongoing power abuse scandal.
The sheer size of the rallies reflects the public's discontent as the scandal continues to simmer, with more revelations emerging by the day and the president refusing to step down. Rally organizers estimate at least 1.5 million people have shown up in central Seoul alone, making it the largest protest the country has seen in almost 3 decades.
I came here to amplify the voice of the public, so the president resigns over the scandal. Coming here is the least we can do as citizens.
I believe all movements stem from the younger generations. starting with students. It's our duty as young Koreans to make things right when we see wrongdoings.
The message also resonated with those unable to join the protest. Homes, offices, and stores joined a 1-minute blackout protest. Drivers honked, and people watching from afar applauded. Earlier, following a ruling by the Seoul Administrative Court, protesters were allowed to march up to 200 meters from the presidential office, provided they moved back once the sun set. That's the closest the protesters have been allowed so far. The ruling was reached as the previous rallies were mature and peaceful and passed without any injuries or major clashes with the police. This is the 5th mass protest since the scandal broke, but it won't be the last. The center of Seoul will play host yet another demonstration next Saturday as the people strive to have their voices heard and demands heeded.
Thousands of people in Bangladesh gathered to protest the persecution of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. The protest took place on Friday, November 25th, with an estimated 10,000 people marching in the streets of Dhaka chanting, quote, "Stop killing Rohingya Muslims." Although Rohingya people have lived in Myanmar for generations, the local government doesn't recognize them as citizens. Amnesty International says attacks against Rohingya Muslims have increased significantly in response to an assault against 3 border posts that left 9 officers dead. The organization reports instances of Myanmar security forces firing at villagers from helicopters, burning hundreds of homes and raping women. Local media in Bangladesh say thousands of Rohingya Muslims have been smuggled into the country looking to escape persecution. But the government has upped its border patrol and many refugees are being sent back. Champa Patel, Amnesty International's South Asia director, said Rohingya Muslims are, quote, trapped between these cruel fates. The Malaysian Foreign Ministry has since called on the Myanmar government to intervene.
To Brazil now. Thousands have taken to the streets of Sao Paulo to protest against a proposed constitutional amendment in the country. Demonstrators also chanted slogans against President Michael Temer as they marched through Sao Paulo's central Paulistas Avenue. The proposal would set caps on public spending over the next 20 years. It would also track public spending to the inflation rate over a 20-year period, with the chance of recalculated base rate after 10 years. Critics argue that education and health would be the worst hit under this move.
We are here fighting to put pressure on the Senate to block the passage of these measures, just as Temer doesn't have the slightest conditions to govern. He's shown he doesn't have the slightest legitimacy to remain atop the presidency, which is already illegitimate because of the coup and the complaints which have put the government on the hot seat. We aren't going to allow for these measures, which attack public services and workers' rights, to be approved.
When we go out to the streets, the politicians start to tremble. They tremble from fear of the strength of the people, and it is this social pressure that they want to apply with the government and the Congress and everything else.
We'll begin with Bahrain, where Bahrainis have been rallying in several villages to vent their anger at the ongoing crackdown by the ruling Al Khalifa family on dissent. The demonstrators in the village of Diraz protested a ban on Friday prayers, which has been in place now over the past weeks. Security forces prevented protesters from approaching the home of prominent Shia cleric Sheikh Isa Qasim in Diraz as well. And they had planned to gather in front of the Sheikh's house. The Manama regime revoked his citizenship back in June. Meanwhile, an anti-regime rally in the village of Sitra has turned violent with clashes between protesters and security forces. The demonstrators are demanding the release of Diraz citizen Said Alawi Hussein Alawi, who was detained last month with no arrest warrant.
Sayyid Alawi Hussein Alawi, 43 years old, a resident of Diraz, disappeared on October 24th. His family told Bahrain Center for Human Rights that they received a last call from him an hour before he disappeared. Hussein Alawi had called his family to tell them that he would be late due to the workload, but he did not return home, and later in the day, the police station called Alawi's family to inform them that he was being detained at the Criminal Investigation Directorate. The whereabouts of Alawi remains unknown, as authorities refuse to give information to his family.
The Bahrain Center for Human Rights has previously documented other cases of what it calls forced disappearances since pro-democracy rallies broke out back in 2011.
Opposition parties in India have organized a day of anger protests countrywide against demonetization of banknotes. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's recent move to withdraw 500 and 1,000 rupee bills brought dissatisfaction. The legal tender to curb corruption comes as the deadlock continues in Parliament, with the government rejecting a discussion in the lower house of Parliament that ends in a vote. To talk more about this, I'm joined by Kumar Dhananjay from New Delhi. Hi there, Kumar. The measures taken by the Indian government were brought in several weeks ago. Why is this protest being held now?
You know, what has happened is that after the measures were announced on 8th of November by the Prime Minister Modi, suddenly 86% of the currency went out of the market. And this country of more than 1 billion people were left to survive on just 14% of the currency. So the banks had no money, ATMs had no money. So this anger was brewing because people had to stay in line for hours to get their hard-earned money.
Thousands of Italians staged a rally in the capital against the proposed constitutional reforms by Prime Minister Matteo Renzi. It was the second day of protests against the reforms. The demonstrators chanted slogans while carrying placards and banners against Renzi's call. Prime Minister said that change is necessary for Italy. Main objective of the reform proposed by the government is to restrict powers of the Senate to simplify the process of passing laws. Surveys conducted 2 weeks ago before the referendum revealed that the opponents of the reform were in the lead. However, many citizens are still undecided. Officials in the Central African Republic say that week-long clashes between rival armed factions have claimed the lives of scores of people and displaced thousands of others. According to the country's communications ministry, fighting that began back on November 21st has so far killed 85 and displaced 11,000 civilians. Dozens of people have also sustained injuries during the fierce clashes. Fresh round of violence erupted between the armed militia groups of the Seleka and Anti-Abalaka in the town of Bria, northeast of the capital Bangui. The impoverished African country plunged into chaos in 2013 when Anti-Abalaka militia began coordinated attacks against the Seleka group.
In Uganda, several days of fighting between security forces and a militia linked to one of the country's tribal kings have left at least 55 people dead. The fighting began after members of the militia attacked soldiers in the western town of Kasisi on Saturday. They were upset at the arrest of their tribal king, Charles Wesley Mumbere, who is being accused of supporting a separatist movement in the region.
Streams and dropping reservoirs, which may not be sufficient for getting residents through the winter.
Arctic sea ice is melting at such an alarming rate that scientists are warning it might trigger uncontrollable changes across the globe. The Arctic Resilience Report, published Friday following a 5-year study, warns of 19 tipping points, conditions that, once met, fundamentally alter the function of an ecosystem. One of the biggest points of no return in the Arctic would be a change.
China's smog could make it more difficult for people to fight off some infections. The air pollution has traces of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. A team from...
According to the Associated Press, Southerners are beginning to feel the effects of a drought that is continuing past its 8th month. Among the damages, water fountains have dried up, beaver dams have been demolished, and drinking water in one southern town is turned brown. Watering lawns and washing cars have been restricted in parts of the South, and more restrictions are expected if below normal rainfall continues through the rest of 2016. The EPA has reported low.
A university in Sweden took over 800 samples of DNA from humans, animals, and various environments across the globe. In Beijing, the air samples contain DNA from genes that make bacteria resistant to some of the most powerful antibiotics we have, including carbapenems. Carbapenems are a sort of last resort antibiotic doctors can prescribe to treat certain infections caused by resistant bacteria. The team notes there's probably a mix of live and dead bacteria in the air, and it's the live bacteria that could be a real threat.